I wanted to find out if I could steal the 2024 presidential election. Like, legitimately look into, could I impersonate voters at the polling places?
Yeah, could you vote twice? Could you put on glasses and come back and vote again?
Could I hack the machines?
Could you request your mail ballot and then make a bunch of copies and vote 10 times?
Specifically, I wanted to see if I could do this in Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania was very important and very close in the last two elections, and it looks like it's going to be again. And the closer the vote is, the fewer votes that I have to steal. So to get some inside information, I called up two people who know Pennsylvania elections really well. Kathy Boockvar, the former Secretary of the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, the Democrat who oversaw elections in Pennsylvania in 2020, and Seth Bluestein, a Republican who's been running elections in Philadelphia for over a decade. So we're going to look under the hood of elections and follow two ballots, one in-person ballot and one mail-in ballot. Follow them through this entire process to see if I can find a way to steal this election. We'll start with an imaginary man named Sylvester who lives in Howe Township, Pennsylvania.
Wait, this is not a real place, is it?
This is a real place.
There's a Howe Township in Pennsylvania? I thought you were just making that up.
No, it's real. It's in one of the smallest counties, Forest County, which has about 3,000 registered voters. And it's important to mention that U.S. elections are run by counties. The states and the feds set some rules, but the counties are really in charge. So Sylvester's going to vote in person at his assigned polling place, this little building on a country road. And the first step is to check in by signing his name in the poll book.
Now, the poll book is the list of all the registered voters who are eligible to vote in that division.
And so this is sort of the first place where, you could imagine
Shenanigans,
exactly.
Could you show up and vote even if you weren't actually eligible to vote?
I'm registered in Florida. Could I get in to Pennsylvania and vote?
The first time you vote in any precinct, you have to show ID.
For your ID to match what's in the poll book, you have to have registered beforehand. And when you register, you also have to give an ID number and a legitimate address. And if you get caught lying, you could go to jail for 5 years.
We check to make sure that the addresses exist and the people are qualified and determined to be eligible.
It seems like the key thing here is that each polling place doesn't have the same list. They have a very specific list that you have to be on in order to be able to vote.
The counties coordinate with different agencies and other states to cross off the names of people who have died or moved, or in some rare cases, are not citizens.
But how would they get registered in the first place?
Usually when these cases crop up, it's a case of sort of human error at the DMV. A clerk wasn't paying attention and offered you the chance to register, even though you said you were a non-citizen. But non-citizens actually voting is incredibly rare. A Heritage Foundation database of voter fraud lists just 85 such cases in the last 20-odd years, out of over 1 billion votes cast in that time.
Yeah, I know a lot of immigrants here in the U.S., and the idea that they would risk anything about their legal status in order to participate in American politics just is beyond belief for me.
So getting me onto the voter rolls would be pretty tough.
So let's say you know somebody named Joe who lives in Pennsylvania. Could you vote in his place?
You don't know whether your neighbor, whose name you're claiming to be, whether they've already showed up, whether they're even registered. You're taking the risk that any of the people that are there say, you're not Joe Smith, you're Adam Cole.
Who's there at the polling place, and what are those people doing?
On the official side, in terms of who's hired by the government, you have poll workers.
People from the community with different perspectives who can kind of keep an eye on the process.
You always are going to have a judge of elections, who's kind of the top poll worker position. And then we have a majority inspector and a minority inspector.
In Pennsylvania, those are elected positions. And in the vast majority of polling places, they're split between parties, say a couple Republicans and a Democrat.
But then on top of that, we have these multi-partisan poll watchers.
Each party gets to send one person. So if someone is bringing a screwdriver into a polling booth, or, you see a poll worker throwing a bunch of paper ballots out the back door, you're there and you can say, I saw that, and then you tell the district attorney about it the next day.
I wouldn't say it's 100%, but really overwhelmingly, we do pretty well at having a balance of parties in the polling places.
So there's actually a cautionary tale about people trying to get around these observers. Back in the aftermath of the 2020 election, the Lieutenant Governor of Texas, Dan Patrick, made this big announcement.
I'm offering up to $1 million, minimum $25,000 for any case that comes forward that leads to an arrest and conviction of voter fraud.
It's a sign of how rare voter fraud is that he only actually paid out this bounty one time to a poll worker from Philadelphia.
One of the first voters that morning came in, Ralph Thurman.
A 72-year-old Republican.
And he went on his way and voted.
A few hours later, he comes back wearing sunglasses and a hat.
No way.
And signs in as his son and goes and votes as his son. As Dan Patrick discovered, it's very hard to find cases of voter fraud, maybe because the consequences are so dire.
Is it worth it to you to serve 7 years in jail and $15,000 for one ballot?
If we're trying to steal this election, I would say this seems like too big of a headache. There might be easier ways further down the line. So fraud is super rare in elections, but it's much more common on the internet. People are gathering personal information to commit fraud and scams and harassment.
Yeah, I got an email. This is a real email from a couple weeks ago, and freaked me out a little bit. It said, I know that calling, and then my phone number, would be an effective way to contact you if you don't cooperate. Don't try to hide from this. You have no idea what I'm capable of in Brooklyn. And I Googled this really quickly, and I saw that it was a scam.
Yeah, that's super creepy. There are these data brokers who sort of crawl the internet, gathering up people's personal information so they can sell it. And the aim of our sponsor for this video, DeleteMe, is to go around to those brokers and have your personal information removed. I signed up. It was super easy. Very soon after, I got this report from them, this privacy report. You can see that they reviewed 2,000 of these listings and found a bunch of places where I popped up and had that info taken down. So if you want to protect your personal information, you can get 20% off your DeleteMe plan when you go to joindeleteme.com/HOWTOWN and use promo code HOWTOWN at checkout. Sylvester's moved past that welcoming table, and he's confronted by a voting machine. The U.S. has used voting machines for over a century, and a lot of the systems, from levers to touchscreens, didn't create a paper trail. They just recorded the votes within the machine. Part of the reason they were adopted in the first place was that American ballots tend to be long and complicated, filled with more elected positions and initiatives than a lot of other countries. The prospect of hand counting all of those ballots is really daunting.
Right.
They've done careful study of this, and hand counting ballots is more expensive, less efficient, but more importantly, it's less accurate. There's way more errors if you count by hand than if you use these machines.
Right, which
So
anyone who has counted things would know. It's pretty hard.
You know, when I play cards, I have to count 3 times to make sure I, got 7 cards dealt to me or
Right.
whatever. Bottom line, we're pretty stuck with these machines. The question is, could I hack them?
We test every piece of equipment to make sure that they are reading those ballots correctly.
And you can go and watch that. You can look up your local logic and accuracy testing and see it for yourself.
The voting machines are not connected to the internet at all. They're not connected to anything that's connected to the internet.
But unfortunately, that doesn't mean that they're unhackable. Every year in Las Vegas, Harry Hursty hosts a horde of hackers who hunt for holes in the security of voting machines.
We have a lot of machines here that we are currently using around the country.
And they usually find some vulnerabilities.
Never trust, always verify, and use hand-marked paper ballots so that you can verify.
We mandated that all the counties across the Commonwealth upgrade to voter verifiable paper trail voting systems.
It used to be that less than 70% of the votes cast nationwide had this paper trail. Now it's like 98 point something.
Would they be hacking the machine that marks the ballot or the machine that counts the ballot? Because those are separate, right?
They could do either. I mean, let's talk about what happens in Forest County. You go up to the first machine, you punch in your selections on a screen, and it prints out a physical ballot.
You can see who you voted for.
And you really should check, because this is where you can be part of the election security, right? Like, if that machine was hacked, you'll be able to see that it changed your answers. So after you have your physical ballot in hand, you go over to the second machine that scans it and records your vote. And that machine holds on to the paper ballot, and that's so important.
People can see what their paper ballot says before they put it in the counting machine. And if you want to hack the counting machine, then the paper ballot is the check against it.
Exactly.
And that's where the audit comes in.
After every election, every county has to randomly pull 2% or 2,000 ballots to double check, right? To confirm the results that have been reported.
And we do that by manually, with a hand audit, counting up those votes.
Hand counting during audits is a great middle ground because you can literally look at the paper ballot to compare it to the machine tabulator.
So they do this audit regardless of whether the election is contested, whether it's close, anything.
No matter what, every county does this 2% audit. And so you don't really need to perfectly trust the machines because you have this ability to double check them.
When the polls close on election night, the voting machines will print out receipts of the results from those individual voting machines, and the poll watchers are entitled to see those.
And then those results get put on the county website. And in Forest County, they actually tape them to the door of the polling place. Poll workers transport the results and the physical ballots to the county office, and then they put all those numbers together, and then they send that to the state.
Could you just bribe a poll worker to punch in a bunch of votes?
Actually, that has been tried in Pennsylvania.
We verify, we do audits, reconciliation after the election to make sure that the number of people who signed in matches the number of ballots that were cast.
A few years ago, Seth noticed that in one particular Democratic primary race, one precinct had 27 more votes than it had voters.
When we combined that with the audit logs of the voting machines, we were able to see that votes were being cast in very quick succession after the polls closed. We looked at it and we're like, there is something definitely going on here.
DeMuro has been charged with 2 counts. A political consultant paid him money to illegally add votes by literally standing in the voting booth and voting over and over and over again as fast as he could.
Was that enough to change the outcome of anything?
No, from what we can tell, it didn't change any outcomes of any elections.
So bizarre that you would go to those lengths and, risk prosecution for that.
That's why it's so rare. Some sides of the argument will say there's tons of widespread voter fraud. And then the other side might say there's no voter fraud whatsoever, right? And the truth is it does happen, but it's rare. And when it does occur, we will find it and it will be prosecuted.
The more fake votes that are added, the more likely I am to be caught. And so I'd probably want to do this at a bunch of different precincts, bribe a bunch of different poll workers.
But a conspiracy on that scale is extremely hard to keep secret.
Yeah, and also remember, most of these polling places have people who do not want someone to steal votes from their candidate. Like, there's lots of people watching. Only about half of ballots in the U.S. will be cast on Election Day. Some states let people vote early in person. Some let people vote by mail. Penny lives in Philadelphia, a county with over 1 million voters, and she decides to avoid the crowds and vote by mail. She orders her ballot online, again by giving her ID, and gets it delivered to her registered address.
If you had a relative that had died recently, could you request their ballot and then vote in for them?
In 2020, 4 Pennsylvanians were caught casting a vote in the name of a parent or spouse after routine checks, which were performed before the votes could be counted, revealed that those people had died.
How many votes could you possibly steal that way?
Right, exactly. The thing is, all these people have to know that person's driver's license or social security number. So, how many of those do you know or have access to? Penny fills out the ballot, puts it in a secrecy envelope, and then an outer envelope, which she signs and drops off at the drop box down the street. So, could I make a bunch of fraudulent ballots or copies of real ballots and stuff the drop box?
On the outer envelopes, there's a barcode, and that barcode is tied only to you.
And so when the mail-in ballots get returned, they've got to match the mail-in ballots that were sent out.
What if I requested my ballot, voted by mail, and then I still go in on Election Day and cast another vote?
When we update the voter's record to show that they've returned the ballot, they are no longer able to vote at the polling place.
And if you've requested a mail-in ballot but you didn't return it, you have to surrender that ballot to vote at your polling place.
Could a very partisan mailman open that thing up, destroy it?
That's why Pennsylvania has a system where it can tell you if your ballot has arrived at the county elections office. Most states let poll workers start to process ballots before Election Day, but in Pennsylvania, that's against the law. The count starts on the morning of Election Day. Again, you've got these bipartisan teams doing the work and poll watchers watching, and some places even live stream this process. But it takes a while.
A very tense nation still waiting tonight.
What we're waiting for is Pennsylvania.
You got to remember there is a ton of mail. The votes that are out are vote by mail.
We're waiting for votes to come in.
Yeah, we're waiting.
We're still waiting.
We do have to wait.
Joe Biden will win Pennsylvania, putting him over the 270 electoral votes he needs.
Those are unofficial results that were created to feed the need of media and public to have some so-called answer, which is not actually an answer.
They have this period in Pennsylvania and every state in which they are double-checking all the numbers. It's giving time for any sort of weirdness to be investigated. Starting with the 2020 election, they've done this thing called risk-limiting audits,
which uses statistics to determine, yes, the winner of the result that we found actually matches what we would expect.
They roll physical dice to create a random number seed. It's really funny, and they do this publicly.
4.
And those numbers are used to generate random ballot numbers to be pulled and checked by hand.
The closer the race is, the more ballots you want to look at. And this happened in Georgia in 2020. It was so close that they literally audited every single ballot and still confirmed that the results of the election were accurate.
They have until November 25th to do all of this double checking before the counties say to the Secretary of the Commonwealth, we checked, it's all good, we certify these results, and then the Secretary of the Commonwealth signs off on it, certifies the statewide result.
What did you conclude about how you're going to go about stealing this election, Adam? Like, what's the best way to do it if you wanted to do it?
Well, as a potential election thief, I am pretty discouraged. It's just hard to steal an election because there's so many people involved.
Right, and decentralized into all of these tiny little polling places.
Yeah, there's not some master system that I can hack. There's just so many hands involved, so many eyes watching. Elections don't just need to be secure, they also have to be perceived as secure. People have to believe in elections. If I really wanted to interfere with American democracy, I wouldn't try to steal the votes. I would try to stoke this uncertainty. I would really play up the cases of voter fraud that are found. I would spread dubious claims of voter fraud. If elections don't work, your options become increasingly more violent.
We had to have police protection outside of my house to protect my wife and kids. We had to have really good security outside of where we were counting the ballots because gunmen were trying to get in to, correct the problem of counting votes.
Those threats are based in disinformation. So I think that mis and disinformation and that intentional fueling of distrust is what I see as really the biggest threats to our democracy.
So we have all these checks along the way of the actual vote counting process. There's really no check on the spreading of rumors. In fact, it's probably the opposite. We have all of these systems that are sort of designed to juice rumors online.
Yeah, that's absolutely happening right now. And that's sort of part of our mission at HOWTOWN is to try and figure out what's really true by looking at evidence. And we do that with the help of our wonderful Patreon supporters. On Patreon this week, we're going to put up a little video. I talked to some people from Venezuela about their election this year, which was actually stolen. So I wanted to know, how that went down and how they proved that it had happened. And thanks again to DeleteMe for sponsoring this video.